Ashes of Tomorrow, a post-apocalyptic romance audiobook. Chapter 1. The Scream. The silence of the ruined city was deceptive. A blanket stretched thin over the bones of what once was. Kai knew better than to trust it. He moved through the crumbling husk of an old department store, his boots kicking up fine layers of dust and charred plastic. The shelves had been picked clean years ago, but scavengers like him knew where to look. Beneath toppled racks, inside locked drawers, anywhere a desperate soul might have stashed something before the world collapsed. The toy store, half buried in rubble, smelled of old plastic and mildew. A faded poster of some cartoon mascot grinned down at him from behind a cracked display case. The eyes had long since been scratched out, giving it an eerie, lifeless stare. Kai stepped over a rusted tricycle, careful not to make noise. His eyes caught the glint of metal beneath an overturned register. He crouched, prying open the crate wedged behind it. Inside, a few cans of food, their labels peeling but intact. Jackpot. He reached in, his fingers brushing something cold. A half-hill water jug. Clean water. A rarer find than gold in this wasteland. He had just slid the stash into his pack when he heard it. A scream. Muffled, distant, but unmistakably human. Kai froze, his body tensing, listening. Screams weren't unusual, but this one was different. It wasn't just pain or terror. There was fight in it. His grip tightened around the crowbar strapped to his belt as he stepped cautiously out of the store, eyes scanning the streets. The late afternoon sun burned orange through the thick smog, casting long shadows through the wreckage. Then he saw it. Down the road, past the skeletal remains of burned-out cars, a convoy had been ambushed. Raiders, 6, maybe more, circled the wreckage like vultures. Smoke curled from an overturned truck, its windshield spider-webbed with bullet holes. The driver was slumped over the wheel, unmoving. And in the middle of the chaos, her. Kai wasn't sure what made him stop. Maybe it was the way she fought, all sharp elbows and wild kicks, despite being hopelessly outnumbered. Or maybe it was the way she looked. Her skin too clean, her hair still shining beneath the dirt and blood. She didn't belong here. One of the raiders, a broad-shouldered brute with a jagged scar down his cheek, grabbed her by the arm, wrenching her toward him. She wrenched back, twisting like a wild animal caught in a trap. "Let me go!" she spat, her voice raw. The raiders only laughed. Kaya exhaled slowly. This wasn't his fight. He didn't do rescues. He didn't do people. But something about the girl, her defiance, her desperation, set his teeth on edge. A choice settled in his chest, heavy as lead. He had two options: walk away or interfere. His fingers flexed around the crowbar. "Shit," he muttered, already moving. The world smelled of smoke and blood. Elara's wrists ached where the rope bit into her skin, her fingers numb from how tightly they had bound her. She could taste iron on her lips, feel the sting of fresh cuts on her cheek where one of them had backhanded her for struggling. She hadn't stopped struggling. The raiders were laughing as they picked through her pack, tossing aside notebooks, shattered vials, and the few remaining medical supplies she had salvaged from the convoy. "Would you look at this?" one of them snorted, lifting a sleek data tablet. The screen was cracked, but it still hummed softly, clinging to life. "What do you think, boss? Think she's a government rat?" The leader, Scarface, she hadn't caught his real name and didn't care to, strolled over and snatched the tablet from his man's hands. He turned it over, his dirty fingers smearing the once pristine glass. "Nah," he said, his voice thick with amusement. "She's too soft to be one of them." His eyes flicked to her, scanning her in a way that made her skin crawl. "Too pretty." The others chuckled. Elara swallowed the bile rising in her throat. Stay calm. Fear would only make it worse. The leader knelt in front of her, resting an elbow on his knee. You a doctor? He asked, holding up a syringe he had found among her things. Elara held his gaze. Something like that. Scarface grinned. Well, ain't that useful. Maybe we should keep her. The men murmured in agreement, a few stepping closer. Panic flared in Elara's chest. She would rather die than let them take her. She braced herself, ready to spit in his face, to say something sharp-edged and reckless, anything, but before she could, something changed. A strange stillness settled over the street. One of the raiders grunted, swaying where he stood before collapsing to the ground, a jagged metal spike buried deep in his skull. Elara barely had time to process what happened before chaos erupted. A shadow moved between the wreckage, fast, precise. A second raider fell with a sharp, wet crack, his throat cut so cleanly that his body hadn't realized it was dead yet. The laughter turned to shouts. Elara ducked instinctively as gunfire lit up the night, but their attacker was already gone, slipping into the ruins like a ghost. Scarface roared orders. Find him, now! But no one could. The moment one of them moved, they went down, dragged into the smoke and silence like prey caught in the dark. Elara's heart pounded as she twisted her wrists, trying to loosen the rope. Whoever was out there, whoever he was, she wasn't about to sit here and wait to be collateral damage. A figure dropped from the broken husk of a truck, landing smoothly, tall, lean muscle wrapped in dark, scavenged gear. His face was half hidden beneath the shadow of his hood, but the sharp glint of his eyes, cold, assessing, cut through the dim light. Not one of them. For a second, nobody moved. Then Kai did. He took down the last raider with brutal efficiency, snapping his arm back so hard it broke before driving a knife into his side. Scarface snarled, drawing his gun, but Kai was faster, closing the distance in a blink. He drove his crowbar up, catching the raider leader beneath the chin. Bone cracked, blood sprayed. Scarface dropped. Silence fell. Elara breathed hard through her nose, forcing herself to stay still as Kai stepped over the bodies. He crouched beside her, pulling a knife from his belt. He didn't speak as he cut the rope, didn't even look at her properly, just did what needed to be done, then stood and grabbed a half-empty ration pack from one of the fallen raiders. Elara swallowed, rubbing her wrists where the rope had bitten into her skin. "Hi, don't thank me," he muttered. His voice was low, rough, like it had been scraped raw from disuse. He shouldered his pack and turned, already walking away. Elara blinked. "Wait." She pushed herself to her feet, staggering slightly. "You can't just—" "I can," he said over his shoulder, not stopping. Frustration flared in her chest. "I have information," she tried again, desperate now. "About a place, about the vault." That made him pause. For the first time, Kai turned fully toward her, his gaze sharp, skeptical. "Vault?" "The Genesis Vault," she said quickly. "It's real, and I know where to find it." Something flickered across his face. Doubt? Maybe interest? But just as fast it was gone. He scoffed, shaking his head. "You're either a liar or a fool," he said. "Either way, you won't last the night." Then he was gone, disappearing into the ash-filled horizon like a shadow. Elara stood there, the world quiet around her, and realized she had just lost her only chance at survival. Chapter 2. Desperate Partnerships. The wind howled through the ruined factory, slipping through broken windows and rusted beams, carrying the acrid scent of burnt plastic and old metal. The place was nothing but a skeleton of what it once was. Half-collapsed machinery, shattered assembly lines, and scattered debris, all cloaked in a thin layer of ash. Kai moved through it like a shadow, silent, purposeful. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He knew she was following. Elara was careful, stepping lightly, keeping her distance, but she wasn't careful enough. Kai sighed, exasperated, and turned sharply. "Go back," he said, voice flat. She flinched but didn't stop, didn't hesitate. "No." Kai's jaw tightened. He should have let her back at the convoy wreck. Should have let her figure things out on her own, like the rest of the world had to. But instead she was here, small, stubborn, standing in front of him with scraped-up hands and dirt on her face, acting like she had any idea what it took to survive out here. "I don't have time for this," he muttered, turning away. Elara stepped forward. "I have information." "You already tried that," he said. "I didn't care then. I don't care now." "You should." That made him pause. The sheer conviction in her voice was unexpected. Elara pushed forward. "You don't know who I am, but I know what's out there. I know what's left, and I know where we need to go." Kai exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. "You need to go. I don't need anything from you." "You need clean water," she said. "You need food that won't kill you. You need to stop wandering around this wasteland, acting like survival is enough." Her words landed sharper than he expected. She took another step closer. "I'm not useless," Kai scoffed. "No, because from what I saw back there, you weren't exactly winning." Her jaw clenched. He could see the anger flicker behind those bright green eyes, the fire of someone who wasn't used to being dismissed. She swallowed hard and reached into the pocket of her torn jacket, pulling out something small, fragile-looking, a crumpled train map. Kai stared. "It's old," she admitted, unfolding it carefully. "But this..." She jabbed a finger at a faded set of coordinates. "This is real. A pre-war transport system. Underground. Most of the rails are dead, but some might still lead somewhere." She glanced up at him. "To the vault." Kai didn't move, didn't speak. "Because now. She had his attention. Elara must have seen it too, because her expression shifted. Her lips parted, her voice softer now. "I know it sounds impossible, but if there's a chance, if there's even a fraction of a chance, it means there's something left worth saving." Kai dragged a hand through his hair, looking away, cursing under his breath. This was exactly why he didn't help people. They talked too much. They hoped too much. But she wasn't entirely wrong. He glanced back at her, at the train map trembling slightly in her grasp. She wasn't as steady as she wanted to be, but she hadn't broken yet. Kai sighed, shoulders dropping. "Fine." Elara blinked, startled. "Fine, I'll help," he said, voice sharp, warning, "until it stops being convenient." She opened her mouth, probably to argue, but he cut her off. "This isn't a promise," he said. "You slow me down, you're on your own. You don't listen, you're on your own. The second I think this is bullshit, I walk." A pause. Then, slowly, she nodded. It wasn't trust, it wasn't understanding, but it was something. And in a world that had lost almost everything, something was more than most people got. The factory was quiet. Too quiet. Kai felt it before he saw it. That gut-deep instinct that had kept him alive all these years. He stilled, glancing toward the gaping hole where a wall had once been. Outside, the ruined city stretched in every direction, the air thick with the scent of burnt metal and distant decay. Elara, oblivious, was still fussing over the train map, smoothing it out against a rusted conveyor belt. "We should leave," he said, his voice low. She glanced up. "You just agreed to help me 5 minutes ago. What changed?" Kai scanned the shadows, adjusting the strap of his pack. "Gunfire?" Her brow furrowed. "I don't hear." Then she did. Distant, sharp cracks echoed through the empty streets. Not close, not yet, but moving toward them. Elara paled. Shit. Kai was already moving, grabbing his crowbar and slinging his pack over his shoulder. They heard the fight earlier, probably smelled the bodies too. They'll check the factory first. Elara scrambled to shove the map back in her pocket. Where do we go? Anywhere but here. They made it 3 steps before the first figure appeared in the doorway. Kai moved on instinct, grabbing Elara and yanking her behind a stack of rusted crates. She hit the ground hard, barely muffling a gasp, but he didn't look at her. His focus was on the men filtering into the factory. 5. No. 6. Well-armed, scarred, eyes sharp and hungry. Not the same crew from before, but cut from the same cloth. Elara's breath hitched beside him. Kai's grip tightened around his crowbar. This was going to get messy. Split up, one of them said. Check the corners. Kai moved before they had a chance. He came out fast and low, swinging the crowbar in a brutal arc. It cracked against the first raider's skull with a sickening crunch. The man crumpled before he even had time to scream. The others reacted instantly. Gunfire erupted, bullets sparking against metal. Kai ducked, using the cover of rusted machinery to close the distance between him and the second man. He grabbed the guy's wrist before he could aim, twisting sharply. A gun clattered to the ground. The raider barely had time to react before Kai drove a knife deep into his ribs. Elara was frozen, pressed against the crates, watching it all unfold. Then one of the raiders spotted her. Hey, we gotta... Elara didn't think. She moved. Her hand found something cold and solid, a rusted metal rod, part of some long-dead assembly line. She gripped it and swung as hard as she could. It connected. The raider staggered back, cursing, clutching his head. Not enough to kill, but enough to matter. Kai took advantage of the opening. He grabbed the man by the collar and slammed his head into a steel beam. Hard. Elara flinched as blood sprayed across the wall. Then, silence. The factory was still again, save for the ragged sound of her own breathing. Kai exhaled sharply, shoving a body off his boot. His knuckles were bloody. His chest rose and fell with the lingering adrenaline. He turned toward her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, "Not bad," he muttered. Elara blinked. Are you complimenting me?" he scoffed, hardly. He wiped his blade clean on one of the dead men's jackets. "But at least you're not completely useless." Elara swallowed, her pulse still hammering. She hated the way her hands trembled, but she didn't let him see it. Instead, she squared her shoulders. "Glad to impress?" Kai smirked. Just barely, but it was there. Then, in the distance, thunder rumbled. Except it wasn't thunder. Elara's gaze flicked toward the broken wall. The horizon was shifting, swirling, thick clouds of dust rolling in like an unstoppable tide. A sandstorm. And it was moving fast. Kai cursed. "We have to go. Now." Elara didn't argue. Without another word, they ran. Chapter 3. Storms and Shadows. The world above them raged. Wind howled through the cracks in the ruined city, carrying with it the shriek of airborne debris and the sharp sting of sand. Kai and Elara had barely made it to the underground maintenance tunnel before the storm swallowed the streets whole. Now, the world had gone dark. The tunnel was damp, the air thick with the smell of mold and stagnant water. Somewhere in the distance, water dripped, an occasional echo in the oppressive silence. The floor was uneven beneath their feet, slick with grime. The faint beam of Kai's flashlight cut through the blackness, but it was weak, flickering, struggling to stay alive. Elara's breath fogged in the cold. She shivered, pulling her jacket tighter around her. Kai glanced at her from where he crouched near the tunnel wall. "You good?" She let out a soft laugh, breathless and tired. "I've been better." He smirked, just a little, before his expression tightened. He rolled his shoulder, wincing as his arm shifted. Even in the dim light, Elara could see the gash along his bicep, deep, angry, still bleeding. She moved without thinking, kneeling beside him. "You're hurt." Kai sighed. "It's fine." "It's not." He exhaled through his nose, but didn't push her away when she reached for him. That was something, at least. Elara pulled a strip of cloth from her bag, what had once been a clean undershirt, now repurposed for moments like this. She tore it into thinner pieces, pressing one against the wound. Kai hissed through his teeth. "Oh, don't be dramatic," she muttered. His glare was half-hearted at best. "Easy for you to say. You're not the one getting stitched up by an amateur." Elara scoffed. "You're lucky I'm not stitching you up at all. You need a real doctor." Kai huffed a short laugh. "Yeah? Know where I can find one?" She didn't answer. There weren't doctors anymore. At least not the kind that would help without demanding a price too high to pay. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the distant growl of the storm and the steady rhythm of Elara's hands working against his arm. After a long pause, she broke the silence. "Before all this, I was in a research facility." Kai's gaze flicked toward her, interest barely concealed beneath exhaustion. She continued, voice softer now. "I wasn't important, not really. I was just one of hundreds of researchers assigned to preservation projects. We were supposed to be looking for ways to rebuild. Medicines, food sources, power grids. But it was all too little, too late." Her hands stilled against his skin. "When the bombs fell, I was underground. Safe." She swallowed. "My family wasn't." Kai didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Elara forced a breath through her nose, focusing on wrapping his wound. "You don't talk about your past," she said quietly. Kai watched her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, finally, he spoke. "There's nothing to talk about." It wasn't true. She could see it in the way his jaw tensed, the way his hands curled into fists even when he was at rest. There was something, someone, he had lost, but he wasn't ready to say it. So she didn't push. Instead, she tied off the bandage, leaning back slightly to examine her work. There. Not pretty, but you won't bleed out in your sleep. Kai flexed his fingers, testing the movement. He grunted, which she assumed was his version of approval. Elara smirked. "You're welcome, by the way." Kai glanced at her, one brow arching. "Didn't thank you," she gasped dramatically. "Not even a little?" "Nope." "You're impossible." His lips twitched, not quite a smile, but close. "And you talk too much." Elara shook her head, but there was warmth in her chest now. Something light, something almost normal. The moment didn't last. Above them, the storm howled louder, shaking the ground beneath their feet. The world outside was still burning, still crumbling. But down here, in the dim glow of a dying flashlight, it almost felt like there was something worth holding on to. The wind above them had dulled to a steady howl, muffled by layers of crumbling earth and concrete. Down in the tunnel, it was almost quiet, almost safe. Elara hugged her knees, pressing herself against the cold stone wall, letting the weight of exhaustion settle in. Her hands were still shaky from patching up Kai, but at least the bleeding had stopped. Small victories. Across from her, Kai leaned back against an old support beam, arms crossed, head tilted back. He wasn't asleep. She doubted he ever fully let his guard down. But his breathing had slowed, his body looser than it had been before. For a few minutes, it felt like they could finally breathe. Then the growl came, low, guttural, a sound that slithered through the damp air, vibrating deep in Elara's bones. Kai's eyes snapped open. She stiffened, barely daring to turn her head toward the sound. It had come from further down the tunnel, where the shadows were thick and the air turned even colder. The growl came again, closer this time. A slow, scraping shuffle followed, something dragging across the grimy tunnel floor. Elara's pulse spiked. Kai was already moving, silent as a shadow, his hand gripping the crowbar strapped to his belt. He didn't rush, didn't speak. He just rose, shifting his weight onto the balls of his feet. Elara forced herself up, swallowing the tight knot of fear in her throat. Another shuffle. A breath, wet, ragged, unnatural. Then it stepped into view, or crawled. The thing was long-limbed, its skin stretched thin over an emaciated frame. It had no eyes, just a smooth expanse of gray, leathery flesh where a face should be. But its teeth, jagged shards of bone protruding from a lipless mouth, snapped together with a sickening clack. Elara barely swallowed a scream. Kai shifted slightly, his voice just above a whisper. Slow movements. Don't breathe too hard. The creature twitched. It tilted its head, sniffing at the air, its mouth parting slightly as if tasting them from a distance. Elara's whole body went rigid. It's blind. It couldn't see them, but it could hear them. Smell them. She held her breath. Kai inched his hand toward his knife, but the moment his boot scraped against the ground, the creature lunged. Everything turned to chaos. Kai moved first, shoving Elara back as the thing swiped at him, its long claws raking through the empty space where he'd been a second earlier. He dodged left, swinging his crowbar in a brutal arc that cracked against the creature's shoulder. It screeched, inhuman, piercing, and swung wildly, its claws scraping against the concrete wall. Elara stumbled, scrambling backward, her pulse hammering. She needed to move. Kai dodged another swipe, but he wasn't fast enough. The creature slammed into him, sending him crashing against a rusted metal pipe with a dull thud. He grunted in pain, his crowbar slipping from his grasp. The thing loomed over him, mouth opening wider, too wide, its jagged teeth dripping with something thick and dark. Elara's body moved before her brain caught up. She grabbed the first thing within reach, a rusted pipe about the length of her arm, and swung. The impact sent a violent jolt up her arms, but she hit something. The creature screeched, stumbling sideways, its head snapping toward her. Kai used the distraction. In a blur, he yanked a knife from his belt and drove it up, burying it deep into the creature's neck. It screamed, thrashing violently. Black, oily liquid oozed from the wound. It staggered backward, gurgling, then with one final, choked hiss, it turned and fled, disappearing into the darkness of the tunnel, its wet, scraping movements echoing long after it was gone. Silence. Elara stood there, heart pounding against her ribs, the metal pipe still clenched in her hands. She was breathing too fast, too shallow, but she couldn't stop. Kai exhaled sharply, rolling his shoulder with a wince. He was staring at her. She swallowed, gripping the pipe tighter. Next time, Kai muttered, running a hand through his hair. Don't freeze. His tone was gruff, but there was something else there. Something almost like approval. Elara let out a shaky breath and lowered the pipe. The storm still raged above them. The world was still falling apart, but for the first time she felt like maybe, just maybe, she wasn't entirely helpless anymore. Chapter 4. Betrayal at the Enclave. The stadium loomed ahead, its rusted metal framework stretching into the dull gray sky. Once, this place had been packed with screaming fans, the air thick with the smell of popcorn and sweat. Now, it was a shell of its former self, a survivor enclave built within the bones of the old world. From the outside, it looked abandoned, but as Kai and Elara stepped through the main tunnel, life stirred within. Fires burned in makeshift barrels, their orange glow flickering against the cracked concrete walls. Tents and scavenged sheet metal huts lined the lower stands, forming a patchwork city inside the arena. The field itself had been repurposed, a muddy stretch of land where traders haggled over everything from canned food to clean water. People. Real people. Elara felt something strange stir in her chest. It had been so long since she had seen this many survivors in one place. A group of children darted past them, their laughter light and unguarded. A woman sat by one of the fires, humming softly as she stitched up an old jacket. The smell of roasted meat, something real, something warm, drifted through the air. For the first time in weeks, it didn't feel like the world was ending. Elara exhaled slowly. Maybe, just maybe, this place could be safe. Kai, however, didn't look convinced. His shoulders were tight, his fingers resting near the knife strapped to his belt. His eyes scanned the crowd, sharp, unreadable. Elara nudged him. Relax. Kai didn't respond. A voice cut through the noise. New faces. Now that's a rare sight. Elara turned to see a man approaching, tall, broad-shouldered, with a smooth, easy smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Rourke. The moment Elara saw him, she knew. A leader. A man who had learned how to survive not by brute force, but by knowing exactly what people wanted to hear. We don't get many travelers anymore, he said, spreading his arms as if welcoming them to his home. You must be starving. Come, let's talk. Elara glanced at Kai. He didn't move, but his jaw clenched, just enough for her to notice. She ignored it and stepped forward. We appreciate the hospitality. Rourke grinned. That's what we do here. They followed him toward a raised platform near the stadium's old announcer's booth. A throne, for lack of a better word, had been fashioned from scavenged chairs and blankets. People milled around, watching, listening. This was a man who held power here, and he wanted them to know it. Rourke sat down, drumming his fingers against the armrest. So, tell me, what brings two strangers to my doorstep? Kai remained silent. Elara hesitated, then spoke. We're looking for something. Rourke chuckled. Aren't we all? She took a breath. A vault, one that might still have working technology, something that could help. Rourke's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes flickered, Kai noticed. His hand shifted slightly toward his knife. Elara pushed forward. If you know anything, we... Rourke held up a hand. Relax, your guests here. He leaned back, studying them. We can discuss all that later. For now, you're welcome to stay the night. Eat, rest, you've earned it. Kai tensed beside her. She could feel his distrust like a wire pulled too tight. But what choice did they have? Elara smiled, ignoring the unease pressing against the back of her mind. Thank you. Later that night, Elara wandered the enclave, taking in everything. Despite the scars of the world outside, life still existed here. People bartered, cooked, laughed. A small group of survivors sat near a fire, sharing a battered deck of cards. Someone had patched together an old radio, the soft hum of music crackling through the static. It felt normal. Elara let herself breathe. Maybe, just maybe, there was still hope. Elara woke to the sound of boots on concrete. For a moment, she was disoriented. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows against the stadium walls. Around them, the soft hum of the enclave still lingered. Muffled voices, the distant crackle of a makeshift radio, the rhythmic clang of metal on metal. Then she heard it again, closer this time. Her body tensed. She turned her head slowly, just enough to see Kai was already awake. He lay on his side, his back against the wall, one hand resting near his knife. His breathing was steady, his eyes half-lidded, but she knew the signs now. He wasn't asleep. He was waiting. Elara shifted slightly, opening her mouth to whisper. That's when everything happened at once. A hand clamped over her mouth. Strong arms yanked her up, dragging her backward. She thrashed, panic roaring through her veins, but whoever held her was stronger, too strong. Kai exploded into motion. The guard closest to him didn't even have time to react before Kai's knife was buried deep in his throat. Blood splattered against the concrete. Shouts erupted. Elara kicked, twisting hard, sinking her teeth into the arm holding her. Her captor cursed, loosening his grip just enough for her to drive her elbow back into his ribs. He let go with a grunt, and she stumbled forward, spinning around just in time to see Rourke standing at the edge of the chaos, watching. His face was unreadable, but his voice was calm. "Don't fight. It'll be easier that way." Kai grabbed Elara's wrist, yanking her behind him as more guards rushed in. "Easier for who?" Kai spat. Rourke sighed, as if disappointed. "You think I built this place without making hard choices?" He gestured lazily toward Elara. "The Ashfangs want her. I give them what they want, and my people stay safe." Elara's stomach turned. He was going to sell her. Kai let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "That's a hell of a trade." Rourke's expression hardened. "It's survival." The Ashfangs. Elara had heard the name whispered before. Raiders, slavers, monsters. Cold terror crawled up her spine. Kai shifted his stance, blocking her from view. "You made a mistake." Rourke arched a brow. "And what mistake is that?" Kai smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. "You didn't kill me first." Then he moved. The next few seconds blurred together, Kai lunging, his knife flashing in the firelight. One guard dropped, then another, but there were too many. Elara's heartbeat slammed against her ribs. "Do something." She darted toward the nearest pile of supplies, grabbing a rusted wrench. Not much, but enough. Then she saw it. The generator, a battered old thing, hooked up to wires that snaked across the ground, feeding dim power to the stadium lights. An idea hit her like a lightning bolt. She ran. Ignoring the chaos behind her, she sprinted toward the generator, dropping to her knees beside it. Wires, connections, circuits. She yanked one free. Sparks erupted. The lights above them flickered, then died completely. Darkness swallowed the stadium. Shouts rang out. Weapons clattered. Someone cursed. Elara didn't wait. She turned and ran toward Kai, praying he was still standing. He was. Even in the pitch black, he found her, his hand wrapped around her wrist, and they ran. Behind them, the stadium erupted into chaos. Then, a new sound. Engines, distant at first, but growing closer. Kai cursed. "They're here." Elara whipped her head around just as headlights cut through the dark. A convoy of vehicles rumbled toward the enclave. Ashfangs. Too fast. Too close. Kai gritted his teeth. "We need to move. Now." Elara barely had time to breathe before they were running again, dodging debris, leaping over makeshift barricades. Behind them, gunfire erupted. A sudden explosion rocked the stadium as someone, maybe Rourke's own people, maybe the Ashfangs themselves, set fire to the barricades. Flames crawled up the walls. The enclave was burning. Elara stumbled, coughing against the thick smoke curling through the air. Kai grabbed her arm, steadying her. His voice was sharp, urgent. "Don't stop." They tore through the outer gate, feet pounding against cracked asphalt. The last thing Elara saw as they fled was Rourke, standing in the middle of the chaos, his face illuminated by fire, watching them escape. Then they were gone. The road stretched ahead, endless and dark. Neither of them spoke for a long time. When they finally stopped to catch their breath, Elara looked back at the distant glow of the burning stadium. She swallowed hard. I actually thought we were safe. Kai exhaled, shaking his head. His voice was rough. Then you're dumber than I thought. She didn't even have the energy to be annoyed. She just felt cold. Not because of the night air. Because she had actually believed. Because Rourke had smiled, had made her believe. And she would never make that mistake again.